What it's about. Life is too short, and Proust is too long, wrote Anatole France in 1913 after the publication of In Search of Lost Time's first volume, at a time when the remaining 6 volumes weren't even on the horizon. Nobody, not even the author himself, had the slightest idea what the agonizing, drawn-out search for the meaning and essence of art would spawn, a literary universe that tackled or anticipated nearly all the philosophical and psychological questions of his time. The novel deals with the subjective nature of experiencing reality, with the power of the unconscious, and with love, jealousy, sickness, war, homosexuality, pederasty, the transience of life, and death, or merely the creative potency of a childhood memory. Proust remains unmatched in the obsession and attention to detail with which he illuminated every single aspect of human existence. This makes for a lengthy voyage, and you are likely to run out of steam at times. But to dive deeply into Proust's universe is well worth your effort, and certainly not time lost. Takeaways. In Search of Lost Time is a modern narrative experiment in 7 volumes and one of the most influential novels of the 20th century. Marcel Proust suffers from writer's block and fritters away his life as a snob. He experiences antisemitism, homosexuality, and pathological jealousy, getting tangled up in tragic love affairs. Only when unexpected sensory cues provoke distant memories does he start to write his life's oeuvre. In the novel, love and friendship are illusions. People remain strangers to one another and fail to make meaningful connections. Everyone is trapped in their own world, objective thought is impossible. Homosexuality is a central theme. In his novel, Proust processed his own painful existence as a closeted homosexual. Fiction and autobiography merged together. The author modeled many characters after his real-life contemporaries. Proust began by writing the opening and closing scenes of the cycle. The broad middle is the result of a manic creative process that went on until his death. Published between 1913 and 1927, the work provoked outrage, incomprehension, and admiration. The magnum opus makes up Proust's life's work, otherwise, he published just a few essays and stories. An hour is not merely an hour. It is a vase full of scents and sounds and projects and climates, and what we call reality is a certain connection between these immediate sensations and the memories which envelop us simultaneously with them. Summary. Volume 1, Swann's Way. Volume 1, Swann's Way. Marcel Proust remembers his childhood in the family's country home in Cambrai, the drama of bedtime when his mother failed to give him the habitual good-night kiss, the colorful garden flowers, the water lilies on the rivulet Pavane, and the scent of the hawthorn hedges on his summer strolls. These impressions rise from his subconscious upon tasting a Madeleine cake dipped in tea, filling him with a divine kind of bliss. The experience reminds him of childhood Sundays when, before High Mass, his Aunt Léonie in Cambrai would offer him cake dipped in lime blossom tea. No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with the crumbs touched my palate than a shiver ran through me and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary thing that was happening to me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, something isolated, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. It was during one of those summers that he also saw Gilberte Swann for the first time, the daughter of their family's friend Charles Swann. Through the pink hawthorn hedge, she looked him cheekily in the face, and he immediately fell in love with her. The love story of Gilberte's parents takes place before Marcel's time in Paris. Odette is a second-rate actress and courtesan, and the refined, esteemed art connoisseur Swann is initially hardly interested in her. Yet in the salon of the coarse upstart Madame Verdurin, his feelings change when he hears a sonata by the composer Vinteuil. The music turns into the melody of Swann's and Odette's love. Yet their happiness doesn't last long, because the more Swann desires Odette, the cooler and crueler she becomes. Swann works himself into mad fits of jealousy, with hints of Odette's love affairs with men and women fueling his fury. Only her prolonged absence cures the lovesick Swann. One morning he awakes from a nightmare and can hardly believe that he was once in love with her. Volume 2, In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower. 4 years later, Swann marries Odette. Rumors abound that she forced him into the union by threatening to take away his beloved daughter Gilberte. The father looks at Marcel's socializing with Gilberte suspiciously. Indeed, the lad's initially rather childish love has changed. After visiting a public toilet on the Champs-Élysées, its musty smell arousing him, Marcel experiences an orgasm while wrestling with Gilberte. Soon after this episode, he falls gravely ill. Only after his friend invites him for tea, and he feels welcome in her family at last, does his feeling of not being good enough disappear. Gilbert, however, soon shows herself to be egotistical and moody. She seems to find Marcel increasingly annoying. In order to save the mental ideal of his love, he decides not to see her anymore. 2 years later, Marcel travels with his grandmother to the seaside town of Baalbek. He befriends Robert de Saint-Loup, a young aristocrat who is currently doing his military service, and makes the acquaintance of the glamorous Baron de Charlus. Both are descended from the extremely distinguished aristocratic family of the Guermantes. Marcel is delighted to have finally gotten access to this elusive class. One day he sees a group of young girls in sports attire. They appear haughty, cold and sleek to him, like proletarian Amazons from another planet. He later learns that they are the bourgeois daughters of wealthy businessmen. In the beginning, he is sometimes attracted to one, sometimes to another. As in a nursery plantation where the flowers mature at different seasons, I had seen them, in the form of old ladies, on this Baalbek shore, those shriveled seed pods, those flabby tubers, which my new friends would one day be. But what matter? For the moment it was their flowering time. But in the end, he falls in love with the dark-haired Albertine. Before her departure, she invites him to her hotel room. When he attempts to kiss her, she is terribly outraged and rejects him. Volume 3, The Guermantes Way. A few years later, Marcel moves with his family into a new apartment next to the elegant Paris residence of the Duke and Duchess de Guermantes. He falls in love with the Duchess and stakes her out on his morning walks. In a desperate move, he visits her nephew, Saint-Loup, in the garrison town of Doncières, hoping that his friend would put in a word for him with his aunt, to no avail. Back in Paris, he goes to a reception at Madame de Villeparisis' salon. She, too, is related to the Guermantes family, but her salon is reputed to be second-rate. Marcel's Jewish friend Bloch sparks several discussions about the Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus, who faces accusations of high treason. Most attendees come out as anti-Semites. Marcel's grandmother suffers a stroke. After weeks of physical and mental decline, she dies an agonizing death. Several days later, Albertine happens to come by for a visit. She has transformed into a more rounded, female shape. Now that he has lost interest in her, she apparently expects more from him. At the same time, the Duchess de Guermantes, now that he is no more in love with her either, invites him to her salon. Yet Marcel feels entirely let down by the experience. The highborn chatter idly, brimming with pride of place and a fossilized artistic taste. Even the Duchess's famed wit appears forced and works only at the expense of others. Volume 4, Sodom and Gomorrah. From a hiding place, Marcel observes how the Baron de Charlus hits on the tailor, Jupien. It dawns on Marcel that the two men are gay, and he finally realizes why Charlus used to treat him in an exceedingly friendly manner at some times and in an aggressive and offensive way at other times. "Don't protest that you know about styles," he cried in a shrill scream of rage. "You don't even know what you are sitting on. You offer your hindquarters a directory fireside chair as a Louis XIV bergère. One of these days you'll be mistaking Madame de Villeparisis' lap for the lavatory, and goodness knows what you'll do in it." Charlus to Marcel. Marcel feels both revulsion and pity. He compares the fate of homosexuals with that of Jews. No matter how hard they try to deny their nature, sooner or later, vice catches up with the former and background with the latter. Later he attends a reception at the home of the Prince de Guermantes, the Duke's cousin. Here, too, he feels surrounded by anti-Semitism, spite and sophisticated boredom. Moreover, he now tends to perceive signs of homosexual inclinations in most people. In spring, Marcel sets out to Baalbek, a place that painfully reminds him of his grandmother. To distract himself, he meets Albertine. In the casino, he sees her dancing intimately with her girlfriend André. A doctor and friend of Marcel suspects that they are lesbians. Albertine denies the claim indignantly, yet Marcel continues to distrust her. He hardly leaves her alone and is rough and rude to her, until he's finally grown tired of her altogether. However, when she happens to mention a friendship to two women that he knows for certain to be lesbians, he changes back. He is now absolutely determined to liberate her of the presumed vice. The two of them depart immediately for Paris. Volume 5, The Prisoner. Marcel has been trying to write for years. To his parents' great chagrin, he hasn't brought anything substantial to paper. He moves into his family's apartment with Albertine, so that he can better keep watch on her, allowing her to leave the house only accompanied by André. The only time he's truly happy with Albertine is when she lies sleeping next to him, because that's when she truly and utterly belongs to him. Most of the time, though, he works himself up into a jealous frenzy. Albertine, for her part, gets increasingly caught up in a web of lies, denying the acquaintance of certain women only to admit to them when questioned point blank a few days later. When she expresses the desire to attend a musical evening at the Vergerins, Marcel prevents her from attending it and ends up going himself. The Baron de Charlus tells him that he expected the composer Vinteuil's lesbian daughter and her lover to come, but they haven't shown up. Now Marcel believes to have found out Albertine and takes her to task. Her justifications are getting increasingly abstruse, but also her anger at the pointless cat-and-mouse game seems to be mounting. Marcel threatens to break up with her, only to reconcile shortly thereafter. When he finally resolves to separate amicably and travel to Venice on his own, Albertine has already left the house early in the morning, with her bags packed. Volume 6, The Fugitive. Marcel is frozen. He frets about the reasons for Albertine's flight and tries to get her back with the help of crafty stratagems, but to no avail. Finally, in a telegram, he begs her to return. Yet as soon as he sends it off, he receives one from Albertine's aunt, informing him that the girl has died in a riding accident. At first, he is numb with grief. But soon the jealous suspicion comes back. He asks a friend to snoop around his late girlfriend's past and subsequently learns that Albertine supposedly had tender orgies in public baths, and at riverbanks with older ladies and young laundresses. But is that information reliable? He will never know with absolute certainty. Just as Marcel starts to forget Albertine, André confides more secrets to him. She, too, had a lesbian relationship with Albertine, but his girlfriend didn't leave him for other women. On the contrary, she simply realized that Marcel wouldn't marry her and thus redeem her from her sinful life. Later Marcel sets out to Venice with his mother. As the beauty of the city and its women intoxicates him, he becomes aware of his complete indifference toward Albertine. Upon his return to Paris, he realizes that none of his youthful convictions holds true anymore. The once romantic Saint Loup marries the wealthy Gilbert for want of money and turns out to be a closet homosexual. And the same Gilbert confesses to Marcel that she fell in love with him at their first encounter across the hawthorn hedge in Cambrai. The expression that he perceived as scornful was meant, in fact, as an invitation for a secret rendezvous. Volume 7, Time Regained. Marcel spends several years in a sanatorium before returning to Paris at the beginning of 1916. The war has altered the city and its inhabitants beyond recognition. Madame Verdurin, once reviled in high society, now keeps the plushest salon in Paris. Saint Loup has gone to fight at the front, while Gilbert is holding the fort at their country house in Cambrai. She writes Marcel a letter full of despair, lamenting that the beloved landscapes of their childhood have been destroyed. One night, walking through Paris during a blackout, Marcel gives in to his curiosity and steps into an evidently popular hotel. From one room he hears the crack of a whip, followed by a man's groaning and begging for mercy. Marcel peeks through a hidden window. Horror-stricken, he sees the Baron de Charlus fettered to the bed and covered with blood. His torturers just leaving the room, when Jupien enters. The tailor manages the male brothel for the Baron, who complains to Jupien about the harmlessness of his tormentor. That same night Marcel survives a terrible air raid, and a few days later he learns that Saint Loup has died in combat. Historical background. From Belle Epoque to the modern age. In Search of Lost Time is mainly set in Belle Epoque France, a time of relative peace and prosperity between the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The French Third Republic offered perfect conditions for the rising upper middle classes to benefit from the Second Industrial Revolution, also known as the Technological Revolution. As the author, Proust frames his aesthetic philosophy, art, for him, is to look below the surface of things, discover what they have in common, and combine them through metaphors and beautiful style. He finds the call for realistic or even politically motivated art utterly absurd. Full of both nostalgia and irony, he sings a swan song to the end of the Belle Epoque. A connoisseur of the salon scene of his time, and with a mix of satire and regret, he targets the narrow-mindedness of the upper middle classes while describing the inevitable decline of the aristocracy before World War I. With a mix of satire and regret, once again, many years in a sanatorium pass by with no apparent effect on Marcel's state of health. Back in Paris, he goes to a matinee at the house of the Prince de Guermantes. In the courtyard, he happens to step on an uneven paving stone, which triggers the same feeling of happiness that he experienced when tasting the Madeleine many years before. The stone reminds him of the floor tiles in the baptistry of San Marco in Venice. Marcel realizes that these involuntary, sensual memories have one thing in common: the past merges with the present, and for a brief moment, he gains a vantage point outside time, allowing him to see and relish the true nature of things. He understands that, as a writer, he has to decipher the symbols from deep within himself while searching for the truth, show the connection between things and make them accessible to others through his special style. Finally, Marcel resolves to begin writing his novel. But instead of working, I had lived a life of idleness, of pleasures and distractions, of ill health and cosseting and eccentricities, and I was embarking upon my labor of construction almost at the point of death, without knowing anything of my trade. Entering the party, he feels like he's at a grotesque masquerade ball. Almost all his acquaintances have aged beyond recognition. They are afflicted with geriatric trembling, and their faces look like plaster masks. Madame Verdurin has married the Prince de Guermantes, whom the war financially ruined, and is now commanding high society as the Princess de Guermantes. The Duc de Guermantes, meanwhile, has taken the well-preserved Odette as his lover. Whether social position or political beliefs, nothing is what it used to be. Marcel senses that he doesn't have much time left himself. From now on, he has but one goal: to give the people who he remembers in his writing their place in time.